But I'm curious, for like particularly writing for National Geographic or Mother Jones, High Country News, do you ever feel like you're preaching to the choir?
Yeah, yeah.
Or Yes Magazine?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we're aiming for the middle, but I also feel like the people who are way over here are, I think a lot of social scientists have said that you're not changing those people's mind, that you're not aiming for them. And I know that people have done a lot of, there have been a lot of stories about like Catherine Hayhoe, and she's an evangelical Christian, and she's a climate scientist, and journalists have flocked to her as the pivot point to reach people that they might not reach. And she does a lot of public speaking and trying to reach these people, and so, but there aren't that many people in that position for us to write about. So I'm not trying to persuade people on that.
There also is something like 70% of the country that thinks we should regulate CO2 for reasons that they can't quite articulate, because apparently...
Regulate it, or just believe that there is anthropogenic climate change?
No. It's weird, because so there was a poll that came out today where it's like a really high percentage of Americans want to regulate CO2 as a pollutant, but a much lower percentage thinks that it caused climate change, which makes no sense. Because that's the only reason we want to regulate it, basically.
Right.
It's because of the word
Pollutant. That's
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing.
People know it's bad, but climate change has this political valence that they don't want to touch.
And it hasn't always had that. Like,
No,
there was a
not at
time
all.
when- Which one of the Bushes had a plan?
Right.
But
For
first
addressing
Bush.
climate change?
First Bush.
First Bush is a plan for addressing climate change. Then
But he
suddenly,
didn't do any.
Right.
He didn't have a plan. I don't think.
or at
He
least
just,
acknowledge
He had 1,000
Yeah.
points.
Well, there's a
There's
joint,
a
there's a
concern.
there's a joint statement from Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi, like, I don't know.
99.
No, mid-2000s.
Dang.
Saying how we, and, you know, it goes back much further than that. Like, LBJ briefed Congress on climate change, too.
Yep.
and then it became political.
Yeah, just a kind of simple question. I don't know if I articulate this correctly, but is there an opportunity for journalists to focus on, companies, corporations out there who are sort of, they recognize in the back rooms that, okay, this climate change is real, we need to get on top of this. And the best way to do that is to come up with a positive, ecological, whatever image, or maybe some branding kind of issue. And if that opens the door for journalists actually to go in and to sort of take that apart and figure out, like, for example, Lego. Lego came out with, and of course, make plastic pieces, right? Well,
ABS,
if we're
yeah.
going to change, we're now going to make it out of a sugar cane. And so now I'm thinking, okay, now they're going to go down into South America and tear down more rainforests, right? And think about, now they have to transport this all back up. Oh, maybe it's not going back to Denmark, and so all those people are going to have to lose jobs. It just creates an opportunity to sort of, somebody has to police those corporations that are actually going down that road.
Oh, that's
Truth squatting.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
is
a
that-
huge area of this journalism is
Yeah.
writing those stories. I think we've all done some stories
It's
like
kind of
that.
the speaking the truth to power kind of stories. Investigative journalism is what I would call it, really.
I never call myself an investigative journalist, but yeah, there's a lot of greenwash, and there's
Yes.
a lot of corporations are trying to do good things, and you need to have a certain amount of background to know like where to push back and really get behind that
It's tough.
and look at the unintended consequences. And I thought at first that you maybe had you were from a corporation that wanted to be written about or something.
It sounded like that.
Yeah. So do you ever do stories?
I think unintended consequences. I mean, that's actually like a place that I like to look for stories.
Yeah.
I think unintended consequences are fascinating, and they make for fascinating stories. And whether it's about business or science or something else.
Yeah, cascade effects.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, because you recently had this big piece about palm oil,
Yeah.
which is, plays palm oil plantations around the world are destroying rainforest. Yeah, I remember there was something about how, but this doesn't mean that basically boycotting palm oil may not really make a difference. That may not be the solution.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of these things. I mean, what you're talking about, like a lot of these things also, there's unintended consequences, and also a lot of things that are just, there's no simple answer, right? Like, it's so complicated. And so, this question, I did this story for National Geographic where the idea was, like, what's the deal with palm oil? Like, should we boycott it? Should we not? Like, what do people need to know about this? And I mean, there's no simple answer, right? Like, I just kind of went down this rabbit hole into this world where, it's this entrenched, yes, like, it's been terrible for the environment. It's destroying the planet. It's also, like, entire economies and countries are now built on it, and you can't just kind of topple it. And there are a lot of companies that are trying to do things right and make it right. And if you boycott it, then you're sort of inadvertently like helping the companies that are not trying to do it right. And so it's just this
The
whole.
way, for example, palm oil to get to people directly is that it's an ingredient basically in heart disease. So
Yes.
it's one of the oils, right?
Absolutely, and I wrote a companion piece actually where I talked about like if you're concerned and like if you are trying to use less palm oil, like one thing that you could do is just stop eating so much processed food because that's where it is, and in fact like you'll actually be healthier for it, right? And so there's a lot of these things like that's something that's sort of shocking and that we really think about when we think about palm oil. Like so many of the products that it's in, we don't need to be consuming at all, and I think that's something that gets kind of lost in the debate.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions.
Question, Peter, I was really struck by when you said something about what you love about being out of the field as a reporter as opposed to an editor is having your mind changed or getting out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and Elizabeth, you said the story you did on E.O. Wilson ultimately kind of changed your life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious if you would point to some things, some piece of reporting or writing where you're like, not only did I not think I was going down that route, and now I am, but my mind has really changed, and is this story going to be different because of it? And maybe my life different because of it?
I did a piece for, just before the fellowship started, I did a piece for High Country News about the sandhill crane migration in eastern Washington. And I went out there originally with the intent of writing about how these cranes come through there. It's not as large as the Nebraska migration, but it's pretty big. And what I was thinking I was going to write about was how ranchers, or the ranching industry, was negatively affecting the lands that these birds were using. And from my experience being out there, what I ended up doing was writing an article that basically traced my realization of what was actually happening. And I think going back to the question you brought earlier about the division in our country, I think it's really imperative that people in our position recognize our role in that. It's very easy to say that there's one group of people who recognize facts and there's one group of people who doesn't, and that's really not the way it works. There's a lot of people who are consuming a lot of media and they get it from ways they don't have a lot of control over anymore. And most of our life is like that, like whether it's what we're eating or what we're consuming with what we're news. And so I think it's imperative that we recognize that and call attention to the fact that things are not so dichotomous. And so what I ended up finding was that what actually was happening, long story short, these ranch lands were providing the only habitat these birds had left. Without them, without this massive waterworks project that was put in central Washington to irrigate farmland and ranch land, there would be no Columbia Wildlife National Refuge. And there would be no place for these birds to be. And I talked to biologists after biologists, and all they kept saying was the last thing I want to see is a ranch close and a development open, or like more strip malls or another highway or something. And it's hard to swallow that sometimes because I would rather not have the ranch either. Like I would rather we had some open land for birds to be in, but we can't go back, and there's no point trying. So I think that for me was really eye-opening. It caused me to recognize my own prejudices, which is what I want the other side to do too, other people who refuse to listen to news about climate change and things. And if I'm not willing to do that as a journalist, if I walk in every store with this set agenda, then there's no way I can expect somebody else to do the same thing.
I think if the story doesn't end up being different than how you pitched it, then you're not doing a good job as a reporter.
Right.
Like there's no story that's just completely good guys, bad guys,
Tight,
black and
yeah.
white. Like I remember writing about overfishing in New England, and there's this thing called catch shares, which is this great way of addressing overfishing, which is that you sell permits for certain amounts of catches and you divvy them up, and there's just this total limit for the year. And this was in response to like the 80s and 90s just completely destroying ocean life on the continental shelf. So this was like a good conservation measure. But one of the side effects of it was that super rich industrial fishing trawlers would buy up all the permits from small scale fishermen. And so on the ground, I went into the story being like, oh, catches, this is great, we're implementing it. But on the ground, it's like these people with personal economic hardship and stuff. Really bad guys getting all the fish permits, like this guy called the Codfather in New Bedford.
I knew you were going to say it.
Who's now in jail because he was basically completely a shady operator. So it's never this straightforward you can't go in rooting for a side in a story. And it might, I mean, I'm sure it's true that cat shares are better ecologically, but there's all these other parts of the issues that come along with it.
I want to jump back to your question earlier, but also kind of address that question that you just asked as well, because I think as journalists, our job is to find what I like to call bridges of commonality and walk your readers across those bridges so that once they finish reading your story or watching your piece, they're like, wow, that person is just like me. That character is just like me in X number of reasons why they're just like me. And they have a real fear about whatever it is that's impacting their community. Those same conditions could be in my community, you know? I want them to ask that question of themselves as to how am I like this person, or how is that person like me, and how is it what they're doing or not doing is impacting the world around them and eventually impacting the world around me.
So we're bridge builders.
I wouldn't say
I don't
not
know.
always bridge building, but sometimes bridge finders and bridge guides.
Like a
Trolls.
You're a troll.
We're trolls. Predators, trolls, but there are good trolls too. Let's not get it twisted.
The ones with the hair.
They're
The little
dwarves,
belly button.
right? Yeah.
Well,
No.
this has
Yeah.
been a much more uplifting conversation than I expected it to be. I appreciate you guys sharing your insights and experiences, and let's give them a round of applause.
Yes.
All right, David.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Wow, that is wow.
Should we get to keep these?
Fine with me.
What's that? Yes. There's a big message. Celeste. No.